These zooplankton ultimately produce fecal pellets that settle through the water column. The zooplankton are eating this phytoplankton, producing little poop pellets that are going to settle through the water column much more rapidly than they would if they were individual plankton bits and pieces. So these sink through the water column and they break down as they sink. About 0.1% of the organic matter from the surface is preserved in marine sediment, so nearly all of it. 99.9% decomposes or respires before it can become marine sediment. This is known as the biological pump. Photosynthesis in shallow water, settling of organic matter, and decomposition in deep water, resulting in the transfer of CO2 and nutrients from the surface to the deep ocean. So we pump nutrients and we pump organic matter from the surface down into the deep ocean. This is going to result in nutrient limitation. We're going to make as much organic matter as the nutrients will allow, and that means we're going to reduce the nutrients to the point that they're insufficient for more photosynthetic activity. Some of the elements classified as nutrients for marine phytoplankton that are essential for growth can be present at suboptimal concentrations. That's generally the case. When we look at a coral reef, we see a very dynamic biological environment, but there's very, very little nutrients in that water. That's why the water is clear, because it's nutrient poor. We can see some examples of zooplankton here. These are the creatures and critters that are eating the plankton and pooping it out and essentially firing it down into deep water. These are marine examples. Here's a common freshwater example. This is a Daphnia or water flea. This would be one of the main dietary components of sockeye salmon in British Columbia, for instance. This is what they're eating when they're in the lake. Now this brings us to I don't know what you call this kind of diagram, a industrial carbon diagram, I guess. We'll start out with sedimentary rocks. So in this case, we'll use limestone, a calcium carbonate rock, and we can see from lab experiments that if you add acid to a limestone sample, it's going to effervesce, it's going to fizz. This is the reaction of weak hydrochloric acid with calcium carbonate. This fizzing, these bubbles, are CO2. So by adding acid to this rock, we are dissolving the rock and converting it into carbon dioxide and calcium ions. This happens naturally, as depicted here. This is weathered limestone. So acid rain in this case is taking the place of the hydrochloric acid in the laboratory. And it's dissolving this limestone, generating CO2 and calcium ions. So that's what's happening here. The sedimentary rock is going to dissolve, produce CO2 that enters the atmosphere. It can be sucked up via the process of photosynthesis, and it becomes the bodies of primary producers. Now these can die and sink, become part of soil carbon or marine sediment carbon, or they can be eaten. And these consumers, once they consume the organic matter, they're going to either pump it into the terrestrial soil and marine sediment when they die. You know, they're not very important as far as the budget term is concerned. Or they themselves can respire, and that respiration CO2 goes back into the atmospheric component. Now, an alternative turnout or result could be the primary producers go into this soil and marine sediment pile where it decomposes in the sediment pile, either anoxically or anoxically. And the result of this decomposition is CO2 again going back into the atmosphere. If there's anaerobic decay, we're going to generate methane instead. This methane is going to go into the atmosphere. It's fairly rapidly oxidized once it's in the atmosphere. It breaks apart. It's unstable there. So it doesn't last long, but it becomes CO2. So the methane, very, very important greenhouse gas, is converted in this case by oxidation into CO2, which is also a very important greenhouse gas. Okay, so we're looking at a water column now, and we're producing organic matter near the surface. We'll say this is an upwelling zone, so nutrients are plentiful. We're going to make lots of diatoms, lots of radiolarians, forams, and coccolithophorids. And as they are reproducing in the surface water, they're being consumed by the primary consumers, the zooplankton. The zooplankton and the phytoplankton are in turn consumed by consumers like this. This is a whale shark, which means it's a fish. It's the world's largest fish, in fact, and it feeds on microscopic organisms. Here we have some birds that swim, penguins, and let's see, there's a blue-eyed shag here. This is not an effective swimming bird. It's more of a plopper or diver, and they eat krill. You can see that they're eating krill because of this pink poop coloration on the shoreline here. This is some really stinky stuff, take my word for it. And we can actually see it from space. We found a couple what are called mega colonies or super colonies looking at satellite images, and these were unknown up to this point. So once you see a pink zone in a satellite photo, you cruise up to the shore in a boat, you can see this kind of activity on the shoreline. These organisms are going to be consuming the primary consumers. These secondary consumers consume the primary consumers. And what isn't consumed as it's sinking is decaying. As it's decaying, it's using up oxygen. So we start out with 200 micromoles of oxygen per kilogram in surface water. That oxygen is going to decrease as we go down about 1 kilometer until we reach the oxygen minimum zone, where there's relatively little oxygen. That means there's a decreased decay rate in this oxygen minimum zone. As we go further into the ocean, deeper down into the ocean, there's less consumable organic matter. We've already broken it down, and the oxygen levels start to increase again. This is not because oxygen is being generated in this water, it's because it's not being used. The water is coming from somewhere else. We can look at nitrates. Nitrate being a nutrient that's very, very limiting. There's very little of it available in the world as far as plants are concerned. So we have almost none at the very surface of the ocean. As we go down into the ocean, in deeper water, we start to see nitrate increasing. It's not because it's being made in this deeper water. It's because it's being freed up by the decomposition of this organic matter. So as bacteria break down the organic matter, they're freeing up the nutrients again. If we look at total dissolved carbon, again in micromoles per kilogram, we can see that the amount of dissolved carbon goes from very low in the surface waters to, or comparatively low in the surface waters, 2,000 micromoles, to around 2,400 micromoles per kilogram at the oxygen minimum zone. So carbon reaches its maximum where oxygen reaches its minimum. Nitrate reaches its maximum there as well, and it's all because we're breaking down this organic matter and setting the nutrients free. By the way, if you have a neighbor that organizes microscopic skeletons into these kind of displays, you might want some security cameras. Photosynthesis, fecal pellet production, oxygen production, all occur in the surface ocean waters. This is where we have CO2 and obviously water readily available. In the presence of sunlight, we can generate carbohydrates and the waste product oxygen. This organic matter settles, it breaks down. When it breaks down, it releases the nutrients and it uses up oxygen in the respiration process. So now we're reversing the equation, taking carbohydrates, respiring them with oxygen, generating CO2 and water vapor. This nutrient release is ultimately going to pop back up at or near the surface in the process of upwelling. This brings us to what's known as the Redfield ratio. If we take phytoplankton and grind it up and analyze it in an elemental analyzer, we would get 106 atoms of carbon compared to 16 atoms of nitrogen, 1 atom of phosphorus, and 0.01 atoms of iron. What this means is these nutrients, such as phosphorus and iron, are very, very limiting. When we bump the amount of phosphorus and iron up, we get some spectacular satellite images that look cool from space. This is Western Lake Erie, Lake St. Clair here, Detroit is located right here, Windsor, Canada, right here. These cool bright green colors up close don't look so cool. And this is a very common occurrence around agricultural regions. All this area around here, southern Ontario, northern Ohio, southeastern Michigan, these are agricultural regions. So farmers are going to dump fertilizer on their field. That fertilizer is going to run off into Lake Erie in this case and generate this green slime. So what's wrong with green slime? Well, it turns out that there are some microtoxins in here that cause numbness, paralysis, death, a variety of bad things if you're exposed to this water. And people are exposed to this water because they swim in it, they drink it, they jet ski on it, they parasail around it, they live right next to it. So this turns into an ugly situation, both figuratively and literally. When we look at the concentration of photosynthesis as a function of how much of photosynthetic pigments are picked up by satellites, we can see that pigment concentrations are an indirect indication of the rate of primary production in any given region. When we looked at an image like this before, we see the areas of highest productivity where nutrients are pumped into the ocean. So here, coming out of the Amazon, high productivity. Coming out of the Mississippi, high productivity. The farms around central Manitoba, going into the large lakes of central Manitoba, Great Slave Lake, Great Bear Lake, etc., on up into the Canadian Arctic. All very productive because they have big rivers draining into them. The Mackenzie River draining into the Arctic Ocean up here leads to productivity on the North Shore. On the west coast of Alaska, we have rivers and we have upwelling, and so on and so forth around the world. Wherever there's upwelling or rivers pouring into open water, we see areas of high productivity. When we talk about the long-term organic carbon cycle, we need to think about long terms. The short-term fluxes are large. Any persistent imbalance in short-term fluctuations are going to lead to crazy variability in atmospheric CO2, kind of what we're going through right now with global warming or anthropogenically enhanced greenhouse effect. Okay, my dog is upset by that. He's gone. Geological processes become the important controls in atmospheric CO2 on these long geologic timescales. So the fluxes of carbon involved in these long processes are going to be small compared to when we look at the short-term version of the carbon cycle. And the reservoirs are going to be very large, as we saw with that stacked carbon budget a while back. 50 million gigatons of carbon stored in sedimentary rock, 760 gigatons of carbon in the atmosphere. So we can model some of these fluxes in carbon by looking at other related fluxes. Here's an example of the concentration of dissolved nitrate in the deep ocean in micromoles per kilogram of seawater. Maps are drawn for a water depth of 4,000 meters. So we stripped off 4,000 meters of water, and we're looking at the deep ocean basin. What this is going to indicate, this dissolved nitrate, is the amount of respiration, the amount of recycling that's occurred. Up here in the far northwest Atlantic, off the coast of Greenland and Iceland, we see relatively low nitrate concentrations. That's for two reasons. One, the water is downwelling here, so we're downwelling water that's been stripped of much of its nitrate. Once we're into the bottom water here, we'll see this nitrate concentration start to go up. This is the result of this water working its way towards the southern hemisphere. It's the equator, and now it's heading further south. It's getting older and older and older as it's moving south, and therefore more organic matter is breaking down. As that organic matter breaks down, the nitrates are released. Same kind of thing over here, except in reverse. We have the highest nitrate concentrations here in the northeastern Pacific. That's because there's no downwelling here. This water is relatively old, and it is actually in the process of upwelling. So this 36 micromoles per kilogram of nitrate is going to be a rich resource popping up here off the west coast of North America, the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. This is why we see all of the crab and fishing reality TV shows up here. People are willing to take a big risk to fish up here because there's a lot of fish. And there's a lot of fish and a lot of crabs because there's a lot of nitrate. Now, when we look at dissolved oxygen in the deep oceans in micromoles, we can see that this map is drawn for a depth of 4,000 meters. We have the highest oxygen levels here, again in the northwest Atlantic, because we're downwelling, creating bottom water up here, the North Atlantic deep water, which is oxygen rich. It gets plunked down into the deep ocean, and as it moves south, that oxygen is getting consumed as we're breaking down that organic matter and releasing all the nitrate. Again, the opposite scenario here, oxygen decreases as we go further and further north in the Pacific because oxygen is not being resupplied. It's actually the opposite happening here. We have low oxygenated water popping up in upwelling off of southern Alaska, the Aleutians here, and supplying nutrients to that surface water. Carbon burial and sedimentary rocks. The flux of land-derived and marine sediment to the seafloor fills sedentary basins. Many of these sedentary basins are going to be on the margins of the continents. The supply of sediment to basins leads to burial of previously deposited material, and eventually the sediment becomes lithified, and during this process, it embraces and entombs the organic carbon within the sedimentary rock, and it stays there until weathering releases the material to the biosphere. Or maybe this material gets pushed down a subduction zone and smoked out of a volcano. So here we have carbon leaks and oxygen replenishment, illustrated by a couple slides. Organic carbon burial represents a leak of material from the short-term organic carbon cycle. Oxygen is removed from the atmosphere by chemical reaction with reduced material like organic matter that we've been talking about. This organic matter may be preserved in rocks that gets exposed at the Earth's surface. The oxygen also may be exposed to reduced volcanic gases such as hydrogen, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide that get emitted from volcanoes near subduction zones or anywhere else. Here we have an organic rich sedimentary rock, a black shale. Over here we have a nearly pure carbon organic rock known as coal. So this is a coal mine in British Columbia that is in some kind of trouble over doing something right now. You can see for scale, these are gigantic trucks. So this is a huge amount of organic matter that's being extracted as reduced carbon. We're going to stick it in a furnace. We're going to burn it in the presence of oxygen and generate lots of CO2, mercury, arsenic, all the other stuff that comes out of coal. And in doing so, we're converting this reduced carbon to oxidized carbon in the atmosphere. The loss of oxygen is very slow. The amount of oxygen in the atmosphere would approach zero after a couple million years if oxygen was not put back in the atmosphere via principally photosynthesis. Oxygen is replenished by the leak of organic matter in sedimentary rocks. So by hiding organic matter, we boost oxygen in the atmosphere. And that's basically a one-to-one relationship. For every carbon atom that enters this reservoir as organic carbon, one oxygen molecule is left behind. Every carbon atom that's stored here in the BC coal mine sends an oxygen atom into the atmosphere. This is because the oxygen liberated during photosynthesis of that carbon was not utilized during respiration or decomposition, and thus the gas remains in the atmosphere. This waste product from photosynthesis is not going to be consumed by respiration. The formation of fossil fuels requires burial and isolation from the atmosphere. During burial, organic matter in the sediment undergoes significant changes in its structure and chemistry, and if exposed to the right conditions, the result is going to be fossil fuels. These fossil fuels may form after sufficient organic matter accumulates and is altered. And by that we mean may form economic deposits. Sediment derived from land plants, especially peat, which forms in swamps and bogs, accumulates on land or in basins near shore. If the concentration of terrestrial organic matter is high in these basins, burial processes under high pressure and temperature can lead to the formation of coal. Petroleum, on the other hand, results if high concentrations of organic matter and marine sediment, generally, are heated under high pressure. So you're heated to the right temperature, under the right pressure, you get oil. The oil can be really good, light, sweet crude, or it can be heavy, dark, horrible stuff. The sedimentary organic carbon reservoir. Sedimentary rocks contain the greatest quantity of organic carbon on Earth, approximately 10 to the 8th gigatons of organic carbon. Most of the organic carbon is found in shales, as we saw in the previous image, fine-grained sedimentary rocks formed by lithification of mud. This mud can be clastic or it can be carbonate. The residence time for the sedimentary organic carbon reservoir is about 200 million years. So this is a very long-term changeover or turnover compared to photosynthesis and the leaves falling off trees every year. Weathering of organic carbon in sedimentary rocks requires that the organic matter in sedimentary rocks be exposed to atmospheric oxygen, either directly, you break the rock and push it into the air, or by exposure to groundwater that contains dissolved oxygen. Now here in the prairies, if you live on an acreage and you have a well, the water is generally anoxic. And that's why when it comes out, it might leave a kind of a slimy reddish color deposit. That's iron that's being oxidized. The pumping, mining, combustion of fossil fuels has speeded up this process by a factor of 1 million or more times. The release of organic matter from sedimentary rocks is occurring much faster than it's being replaced. And that means fossil fuels represent only a short-term energy source. There are people that are pushing to use it as much as possible because they know they're only going to be around for another 20 to 50 years as a living human. They want to get rich. And that's one way to do it. Generate as much as you can. Don't worry about the future. In the inorganic carbon cycle, carbon dioxide readily dissolves in rainwater and seawater. We've seen that in the generation of acid rain. A similar thing happens in seawater. It's a little bit too complicated to talk about in this class, but it does happen. It undergoes rapid chemical reactions to form other types of inorganic carbon. The oxidized carbon in these waters is chemically reactive, and it becomes involved in a number of chemical processes. Because it's chemically reactive, that makes sense. Because they do not involve organic carbon directly, these processes are together referred to as the inorganic carbon cycle. The important reservoirs of inorganic carbon are the atmosphere, the oceans, sediment, and sedimentary rock. The sediment and sedimentary rock carbon reservoirs consist primarily of limestone. Limestone is a rock composed largely of calcium carbonate, generally in the form of the mineral calcite. It can also start out as the mineral aragonite. It's not as common though. The magnesium-rich carbonate mineral dolomite is abundant in older sedimentary rocks, implying that dolomite requires time to be produced. It is being produced in a couple weird places today. There's some being produced in Brazil in some sediments. Off the coast of Florida, Florida Bay, there's tiny amounts of dolomite being produced on some of the keys. And the dogs known as Dalmatians from Croatia produce the mineral dolomite in their kidneys. And I am not really sure why that's the case. I should look into that sometime. There's a carbon exchange between the ocean and atmosphere continuously at the surface. CO2 is continuously exchanged between the atmosphere and the ocean. CO2 enters the ocean, CO2 exits the ocean. That's in a vague, steady state. Distribution of sources and sinks is going to be determined by circulation, productivity patterns in the ocean. In regions of the ocean where high rates of primary productivity have created surface waters with low CO2, CO2 diffuses from the atmosphere into the ocean. Thus, the net flow of CO2 is down the concentration gradient. It's being sucked into marine water where the CO2 concentration is lower than the equilibrium value. Upwelling water, on the other hand, has high concentrations of CO2 because of the decay of all that organic matter. As the water ages and the oxygen is consumed, CO2 is generated. When that pops up to the surface, that water is going to be rich in CO2. So This is a global map of CO2 sinks and sources. This is a net outflow of CO2 from the ocean, whereas the blue here is a net sink. So CO2 is being absorbed here, given off here, given off here, absorbed here. Before humans became good at burning fossil fuels, the flux into the ocean was probably closely balanced by the flux out of it. Buddy.